Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Malebo Sipodi. I am a South African joining you from Sardinia, Italy, and I am the moderator for today's digital dialogue. For the benefit of participants who are blind or who have visual impairment, all speakers will begin with a short self-description. I'm a Black woman wearing a red head wrap, and I've got red lipstick, and red-framed reading glasses. Digital Dialogue is a series of panel discussions exploring civil society perspectives on the emerging digital world. Today's discussion topic is digital diplomacy and civil society advocacy. Civil society organizations, CSOs, tend to favor regulated digital spaces, advocating for policies that prevent what is currently perceived as a free-for-all scenario where a handful of tech giants disproportionately benefit from unregulated digital platforms. CSOs, therefore, strongly support efforts to negotiate and create frameworks that can hold both governments and private actors accountable. One such example is the active involvement of civil society in forums like the United Nations Internet Governance Forum, IGF. While the IGF has fostered significant civil society participation, the long-standing process does not produce negotiated outcomes. The best it can hope for is to facilitate dialogue, inform policymakers, and inspire both the public and private sectors. A more ambitious process in this regard is the Global Digital Compact, GDC, organized by the United Nations, which aims to establish a formal text guiding the governance of the digital world. With over 6,000 comments already submitted from a wide range of stakeholders, including CSOs, governments, and private companies, there's a clear indication of broad interest and engagement in shaping the future of digital spaces. The GDC's goal to produce a comprehensive agreement offers a glimpse of hope that the international community can reach a consensus on navigating the challenges posed by digitalization. However, optimism is tempered by past experiences with similar compact processes on corporate responsibility, refugees, and migration. These processes often result in non-binding documents, which, while symbolically important, lack the enforceability to drive real change. This raises a critical question. Is there truly cause for celebration in such processes? While they offer a platform for dialogue and consensus building, some observers are skeptical about their tangible impact, especially on issues of human rights and social justice. Without binding mechanisms, the potential for meaningful change remains uncertain. Adding to this complexity is the existence of parallel negotiation tracks, often less visible than the GDC, but equally important. Questions about whether humankind are cyber citizens, cyber consumers, or potential cybersecurity threats aren't trivial, and hence it might be necessary to keep an eye on the ongoing WTO, World Trade Organization negotiations on e-commerce and cybersecurity negotiations. To help us discuss these issues and more, we are delighted to welcome the panel today. Africa Kiza, who is a development anthropologist with 11 years of experience working on trade and investment, policy analysis, and activism in Africa. Africa identifies as a Pan-Africanist working for real liberation of Africa. He's currently a PhD fellow at Hamburg University. Welcome, Africa. And then we have Christian Leon, who is the current executive director of the internetbolivia.org Foundation and the executive secretary of the ASA Consortium, which brings together 11 digital rights organizations in the region, and advisory board member of the Digital Democracy Initiative. Welcome, Christian. And then we've got Hlengiwe Dube, who is an expert on information rights, including freedom of expression, access to information and data protection, complemented by strong expertise of technology intersection with human rights. She is finalizing her doctoral studies, focusing on complex dynamics of state surveillance in the context of human rights and public security. She's based at the Centre for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria as a project mentor Manager of the Expression, Information and Digital Rights Unit. Welcome, Thengiwe. An extended version of the speakers' panelist bios will be posted in the chat box. To start off today, each panelist will introduce themselves and frame the issue by sharing the current landscape and their key points for around 5 minutes. And then we'll have some discussion and questions. At any point during the presentation, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. We won't get to all of them, but we'll certainly try. Africa, would you please turn on your camera and join me here? Africa is originally from Uganda, but today he's joining us from Hamburg, Germany. Would you please introduce yourself, share your key points, and start with a brief self-description? Welcome, Africa.
Thank you so much, moderator Malebo, and good evening or good afternoon to everyone, wherever you are. It's good to see colleagues from Uganda and other African countries, which to me, I think gives me joy. My name is Africa Chisa. I am I'm a Pan-African. I am an activist and a researcher who looks at post-colonial aspects of Africa and the global South in the global economy. And it is important when we start on that aspect to understand the current of the digital economy and how they impact on digital diplomacy from the context of society. So the first aspect is to understand the geopolitics that are shaping digitalization debate. So we are having three pronged process. Three processes are happening parallel to each other. The first process, like the concept note says, is at the IGF. The other process is the global compact. And the next process, which is very critical, and I stress this one, is at the World Trade Organization, where we are negotiating digital trade rules. The challenge here is that the first two processes, the IDF and the Global Digital Compact, they are non-binding processes, and they are crafted with best endeavor language. So they make commitments, but these commitments are voluntary. This is the same challenge that happened to Sustainable Development Goals. That is why we have barely achieved 50% of the SDGs. Because while the IGF processes and the Digital Global Compact talk about, for example, governing data, ensure that those countries that are still catching up are able to leverage data for their development. At the World Trade Organization, where decisions are linked to all parties, negotiations on e-commerce have actually fronted data liberalization. And we may ask ourselves why this is very important aspect. Why should we be against liberalization of data? Because currently, liberalization of data is happening in a terrain or an environment where there is highly unequal countries in terms of access to digital infrastructure, in terms of capacity to utilize data for e-commerce, for the environment, for agriculture, for manufacturing, and all that. Find that only two countries, US and China, control 50% of the world's data centers. They also control 90% of market capitalization in the big economy. So we are having a highly unequal digital landscape that if we allow free flow across the border of data, this might risk having countries that are still lagging behind and able to catch up. Again, under the geopolitics, it is key to note that at the World Trade Organization, even when the United States is the dominant actor in dictatorship, it has pulled out of e-commerce negotiation aspects on data free flow of free cross-border flow of data. Because the United States feels that this would be committing policy suicide if we allow for cross-border free flow of data. But the irony here is that countries which are still cutting up, like countries especially in Africa, have actually, and the global south, I should say, have been actually convinced it is only through liberalizing data, it is only through accepting liberal data regimes they will be able to digitally transform the economy. So that is the geopolitics. Now, there have been contestations among this geopolitics, where I am going to finish in the next 2 minutes. One of the contestations is through civil society and negotiators from Africa, the World Trade Organization. Currently, the negotiators, representatives of the Africa group, the World Trade Organization, remain less committed to e-commerce because they note that the current liberal agenda on data flow, which prohibits location of data centers in Africa, which prohibits disclosure of source code, they believe that this kind of liberal regime will inhibit their capacity for local tech startups with their competitiveness and be able to gain free participate in digital trade. The second contestation is the fact that when you look at, for example, African countries, they are ill-prepared or less prepared to regulate the digital economy. Africa, which has 55 countries, only has 34 countries that have data protection laws. And out of these 34 countries, only 22 have data protection authorities. That creates a challenge. We are having a problem where you find that institutions and countries are not at par with the speed at which recession is happening. And lastly, the pushbacks that we have seen. We have seen a civil society, and this is a case I'm presenting. We have seen two aspects of critical pushbacks. One is a pushback through mobilization by civil society at a global scale through an institution called Awards Not for Sale. This is a coalition, loose coalition of civil society organizations that are calling for reforming the World Trade Organization to allow and slow down e-commerce negotiations in order to ensure that civil society are able to supply further provisions. But the challenge is when it comes to civil society participation, the World Trade Organization is an exclusive platform for governments only. And there has been a lot of gagging of civil society. That's the challenge. Lastly, another pushback we are seeing is forging of partnerships between global north institutions like Bread for the World, Los Luxembourg, and other like-minded organizations that are supporting civil society in the global south in terms of building their capacity in research and advocacy on digital governance. I submit, Chair.
Thank you so much, Africa. I'm really interested to see how the challenges that you brought up link with what the rest of our panelists are going to say. And I'm looking forward to when all of you discuss in terms of each of your points. Thank you so much again. You can We look forward to hearing more from you. I would like to welcome Christian to join me on the screen. Christian is currently in La Paz. Good morning or good day, Christian. Please turn on your camera, unmute yourself, and share your opening comments. And don't forget to begin with a self-description.
Thank you, Malibo, and thank you for inviting me. Hi all, I am Christian Leon. I'm a white Latino male. I identify myself with the pronoun he, him, and I have a beard, short hair, and I'm wearing a black t-shirt and a brown blazer. So it is an honor for me to be in this space and share with you some perspectives and ideas regarding how I see the current internet governance processes, with emphasis on the recently approved Global Digital Compact. Uh, let's start saying that the GDC, the Global Digital Compact, is a key opportunity to build a global action plan that addresses the multiple inequalities that we are currently facing, that inequalities that, of course, are affecting our societies. Nonetheless, I would like to reflect on three aspects related to the GTC that I think are critical to the priorities and the needs of several Latin American countries. The first aspect refers to the content of the GDC itself. The GDC, of course, is a pivotal document that includes five objectives, such as close all digital divides, expand the benefits of digital economy, foster an inclusive, open, safe, and secure digital space, and so on. However, there is still room for improvement in aspects that, at least in Latin America, are of a great concern. Some of these improvements are, for example, to guarantee that the effective participation of most vulnerable communities in the shape and implementation of connectivity policies. Also, to develop digital literacy policies that take into account contextual, linguistic, and social disparities and adopt a perspective of gender, ethnicity, race, geographic location, age, disabilities, and other indicators of minority populations. Also, to prohibit mass surveillance and ensure that targeted surveillance complies with international law criteria, and to increase the public accountability that we have to big tech platforms and companies. So these are some aspects related with the content, but there are other two elements that I want to bring. The second element that I want to bring concerns the future of the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. Although the GDC claims the multi-stakeholder model and promotes it, in practice, this model is disappearing. In recent years, as multilateral stakeholders, including the UN itself and all of its agencies, have entered the scene of internet governance, they have changed some of the rules in a clear detriment of weaker stakeholders, such as civil society organizations. The UN, we must not forget, is an organization of states. That is why, in the whole discussion of the GDC, civil society organizations had less time had less time for participation. Their contributions were not all taken into account, and the final discussions were made all between governments. Just to look at the Summit of the Future, it had higher costs and barriers for participation of several of our organizations. What is worse is that the governments of our countries had to approve whether we could participate or not. In some countries with very restricted civic spaces and authoritarian governments, this can become a major problem. The same thing is happening with other important discussions and debates, such as the YCs, the UN Convention of Cybercrime, the UNESCO processes to generate soft laws for AI, platform regulation, the World Trade Organization that Africa mentioned, among others. They are all becoming multilateral. Therefore, I think it's extremely important that the GDC can create a mandate for our states to necessarily coordinate its implementation with civil society, academia, and companies. The GDC can become an instrument for governments to take us out of the critical conversation. The third aspect that I want to bring, and last element, is that the role that the GDC can have in terms of development cooperation in countries of the Global South. The presence of UN agencies and their influence in the politics of our countries is very different from the influence that they have in the countries of the Global North. In this sense, the GDC is also a geopolitical instrument because it implies a series of guidelines that, even if they are only soft law and they are not binding, are conditioning factors for future development programs and projects in our countries. In spite of this, these are countries that have the least opportunities for participation and influence in the GDC. For example, my country did not have the same capacities and the same opportunities to participate in the elaboration of the GDC as countries of the Global North. Not having this in mind, it is to deny the historical relation between development and colonialism, and how this relation is being also taken to the digital transformation. The question is, how can we change this and avoid that the GDC can become an instrument for neo-colonialism? So those were some ideas that I wanted to share with you and to let the discussion flow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian. Just being wary of time, I am going to invite Hlengiwe. Welcome, Hlengiwe. And Hlengiwe is currently in South Africa. Hlengiwe, may you please switch on your camera and unmute, and please don't forget to start with a self-description. We look forward to hearing your points.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and much appreciation to the organizers for this. I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this. I'm Hlengiwe Dube. I am a Black African woman, and today I decided to wear black and gray. That's the brief description that I have of myself. Thank you so much. So thank you so much for the opportunity once again, and I'm glad to be part of this conversation as we continue to discuss the Global Digital Compact, which is a very crucial commitment. I think it's also important to chime in also and have these very important conversations, specifically because they resonate with our very deeply with our society, especially here in Africa. So I'm going to focus my talk riding on what the previous speakers have already talked about, but touching specifically on the issue of the prioritizing human rights in the digital space in Africa. The talk really on respecting digital rights or promoting and protecting human rights in the digital space is very important, and it's also particularly important as we are navigating this era in which we find ourselves in, where there is rapid technological advancement, which makes it imperative to ensure that in embracing these developments, we also uphold fundamental human rights of every individual, including here in Africa. As we already, all of us know that these technologies hold quite a lot of potential, really, for whether it's empowerment, whether it's connectivity, whether it's economic growth and all that. At the same time, we need to be aware of the potential that they come with significant risks involved, and there's a lot of responsibility also that is attached to using these technologies. And yes, we see the transformation of our societies, but we also see the complex challenges as well that threaten human rights across the continent. For instance, we see the offline inequalities that have been exacerbated by the much talked about digital divide, but there are also issues of increased surveillance and censorship that we're also witnessing as a result of our, especially the state actors that are increasingly investing on digital technologies that have a surveillance capabilities, and that's impacting on several human rights, including the right to privacy. So as I'm reiterating that, as we commit to the Global Digital Compact, this is necessary really to prioritize human rights in any talk on digital technologies or emerging technologies. So let me just zero in on a few key issues. Looking specifically at the situation in Africa, where we are not homogeneous, but there are issues that seem to be recurring across the continent or similar across the continent. If you look at some of the standards that we use on the continent, for instance, the Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa, it specifically makes reference to universal access to the internet as a right. But if you look at the situation across the continent, there are millions really of individuals, communities that are yet to even have meetings such as these ones where we are meeting virtually, because there is generally just no connectivity. And sometimes the internet is there, but issues of reliability also come into question. And this digital divide then marginalizes entire communities or some communities, and it hinders their ability to engage in, the digital economies, for instance, that the previous speaker alluded to, or just even engaging or participating in social life or public life. All those become very much compromised. I also want to touch on the issue of personal data, which the previous colleague spoke to, around the situation in Africa, where a lot of countries still do not have data protection legislation. And those that have the data protection legislation, you find that we do not have robust implementation mechanisms. As a result, some of these laws, they are not properly implemented. Some of them are not fit for purpose. They require a lot of revision, but also generally we don't have a system that has effective data governance mechanisms. And just alluding to the other fact that the other issue that is spoke to of access to data or the use of data in digital economies, we're also in that situation where access to data is still much of a challenge in Africa, but it's also existing in a situation where data governance as well is very shaky and it needs a lot of attention. That also dovetails into issues of privacy, data privacy and security as well. Which is not just about protecting information, but also about protecting individuals from exploitation and discrimination. The discourse around privacy, data protection in Africa is still very nascent, developing, but we have, of course, countries such as Kenya is through its data protection authority. I think it's trying. It's still not at a stage where we are happy with, but it's trying. South Africa also with the information regulator, which is the Data Protection Authority, is also doing a lot of work around promoting and protecting personal information. But the movement around, taking advantage of data or unlocking the potential of data for, human rights and sustainable development is still very new in the continent. It's still something that we need to actively work on. In the context of freedom of expression, we realize that, as much as the digital space is becoming a platform for free thought, for free dialogue, and a lot, especially young people, are actively using that space. Unfortunately, we are witnessing censorship and harassment of those who sometimes dare to voice dissenting opinions. And statistics will show, and the research and some reports would indicate that there are individuals that have been arrested for simply, expressing themselves on these platforms. And it is very important then in that regard to champion the right to free expression online and advocate for policies that protect individuals from especially state-sponsored repression, and promoting responsible use of technology to promote open dialogues and debate online, but also realizing that there are now challenges that are brought about by, using these digital spaces, such as misinformation and disinformation that we see proliferating every day. So as I'm concluding, let me just speak to issues around marginalization and vulnerability. Specifically, I want to talk about persons with disabilities, coming from the fact that digital inclusion is one of the things, as we talk about the Global Digital Compact. Digital inclusion is something that should be prioritized for everyone, including persons with disabilities. And the reason why I'm mentioning persons with disabilities is that they face unique barriers that often hinder their access to digital technologies. And from sometimes, the websites that we use, sometimes they are inaccessible. And there's also the issue of challenges around access to assistive tools or assistive devices. And therefore, in this regard, it's very important. I like the idea that we're having this conversation and there's simultaneous interpretation as well. That's another way of attending to issues of inclusion. So just based on this, it's important that we advocate for inclusive design in technology and policies that ensure that persons with disabilities can fully participate in the digital space, and promote accessibility standards and raising awareness so that we can create an environment where everyone can benefit from digital advancements without discrimination. Also related to issues of inclusion, I just want to touch a little bit on supporting rural communities who are often mostly affected by the digital divide that I've alluded to. We you see a situation where our rural communities usually lack the necessary infrastructure for reliable access to the internet, and for example, electricity is usually non-existent or in limited capacity in those areas, which then remain disconnected. So it's also important to advocate for investment in rural connectivity projects, and also promote digital skills as well, which are tailored to rural contexts. So this should not be like one size fits all training skills or training programs, but these should be tailored to suit the cultural realities or set particular contexts of rural communities, so that they can be empowered to also take advantage or harness the power of technology. And as I just close, I want to touch on a very important group, which is that of children. Some of them now, we call them digital natives, because they've been born in this age, they've been born in this reality. They are increasingly being exposed to everything online, everything digital. But the issues around the risks and such as a lot of exploitation is happening to children online, a lot of exposure to inappropriate content, and also bullying. And there's a lot really that is happening as far as children are concerned, but they're existing in a situation where they seem to be digital natives, but also they're very naive, some of them, about the exposure to this kind of world and the harms that it comes with. And in this regard, we must then implement very effective child protection policies and come up with those policies, not just to implement them, but to contextualize them, come up with them, and then also implement them, but also have supporting mechanisms that educate parents, guardians, or educators about the digital safety and promote a culture of responsibility among the technology providers themselves to create a safe online environment for young people. But in conclusion, generally, I just want to say that we must really commit to respecting, protecting, and promoting human rights in the digital space across the continent, in as much as we are enjoying and embracing the technologies and also being part of the conversation about the global digital compact. Let us be, the advocates for human rights, especially focusing on vulnerable and marginalized groups, some of which I've alluded to. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hlengiwe. Just being aware of time, we are going to move to the second part of today's dialogue and provide the opportunity for the speakers to ask questions to one another based on their opening inputs. I think the feedback or the answer to each other, if they can be as short as possible, so we have time to take questions from the audience. I have seen some questions in the chat box, and please, to our esteemed audience, if you have a question for any of our panelists, please just put them in the chat box and I will post them to the panelists. I now invite all three speakers to turn back on their cameras, and maybe we'll start off from Africa. Is there anything in particular that Christian or Hlengiwe has said that you would like to ask? And maybe just make it general so that both Christian and Hlengiwe answers, and then we'll go on to the questions from the audience, if that's okay with my panelists, just looking at the time. Africa?
Yes, thank you, Marebo. I'm curious to learn from Hlengiwe and the Christian regarding the collusion between states, the states and big tech companies on espionage, spying on politicians who are in opposition or on citizens. Huawei, this Chinese company, Huawei, has been largely, said to be helping countries. An example is in Uganda, to spy on politicians and sometimes stop them when they are, for example, planning meetings and all that. So is that the same thing that is happening in Latin America, in South Africa? What can be done? I mean, what have been experiences with countries and citizens, especially citizens reducing government overbearing and over surveillance on them?
Christian?
Yes, should I answer? Should I answer or make a question just for Africa or?
No. So what I said is, because of time, we are only going to accept one question from Africa to both of you, and you answer, and then we go to the questions from the audience.
So just to answer to Africa, this that is happening in Bolivia and in other Latin American countries. We actually have a lobby from European companies as well as Chinese and Russian companies. So we are in the middle of both. The European companies, well, they use conditioning cooperation in order to get some contracts from the government. And Chinese companies like Huawei, they are using conditioning loans for the government. So anyway, we are trapped in this two-way situation in which we have to decide whether we are at the side of the European companies or at the side of the Chinese or Russian companies. So it's a it's something like you mentioned that is happening also here in Latin America. So I have a question for Helen. So do you think that the GDC can do something different in relation to closing the digital divide in Africa that have not been already tried?
All right,
Thank
thank you. Thank you, Christian. So Tlengwe, you've been posed 2 questions. So maybe you should answer Christian's question since Christian answered Africa's question. And then we'll come back to it if we have more time.
Oh, okay. Great. So yes, the Global Digital Compact, it does raise issues around the inclusion and that. I think what is important is that we have this. It's not the first one to even raise the issue of the digital divide. It's just coming. It's being included there now, but it's something that has been on the radar in these conversations around digital rights for the longest time. And for me, the most important thing is actually making practical steps, so taking practical steps to ensure that the digital divide is closed in its different forms. And yes, we can look at the Digital Global Compact and interrogate its contents and all that. But for me, the most important thing is actually the implementation, what actually happens on ground, what is happening to operationalize what these commitments have said, including the Global Digital Compact. It will be great to see, let's say, Uganda actually taking steps to ensure that there is rural connectivity in the rural communities of Uganda, doing the same in Malawi, and doing the same in any other country. And the relevant authorities taking steps to ensure that there is digital literacy in the communities and improving or incorporating issues of digital literacy, of data literacy into our educational curriculums and mainstreaming these issues where possible, especially in the educational sector, but also in the non-educational sectors. For me, that would definitely improve the digital divide in Africa, because we are going to make, this is not the last one commitment that is going to be made. We are going to be making more of them, but the most important thing is what is actually done beyond making these commitments.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Do you have a question for either Africa or Christian before we move on to the questions? I don't want to close you out. Or can we move to the...
No, it's fine. We can move to the next phase.
All right. So we have a question from Michael Okiro Emadit, and this question is to Africa, and it says, "Thank you for the presentation. At what level is Africa in this context?" So I think Klengiwe did touch a little bit on that in terms of the kind of work that's been done in Africa, but are you able to answer that question with more context?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a brilliant question. When you look at, for example, the core of the digital economy, which is data, Africa only has 2% of the share of data centers globally. And also, even in Africa, only 2 countries, South Africa and Nigeria, account for almost 80% of those data centers. So we have inequalities between Africa and the global north and other countries, but we also have inequalities within Africa when it comes to data infrastructure. And when it comes to dependencies in terms of capacity gaps that SMEs and local tech startups do have, it's challenging. Africa is still lagging behind. Maybe another critical issue, which the compact does not talk about, is the issue of sweatshops that are on a rise in Africa. Now we have seen OpenAI starting data labeling centers in African countries like Nigeria and Kenya, when these countries do not have updated labor policies to guide gig workers' rights. And so we are seeing an emergence of digital sweatshops, just like we had sweatshops in the industrial revolution of the 30s. So I think Africa is still lagging behind. There are some promises. Countries are already now having artificial intelligence policies, but majority of the African countries are not yet prepared, and it is important that we secure this policy space to be able to engage and develop our capacities.
Thank you so much, Africa. I will read a comment from Sohila Y. Hayek, who says the YMCA has already begun its digital skills optimization among the youth in the Global South, and this effort will continue to grow thanks to technology, like it was the case with electricity and mobile telephone. Lack of infrastructure will not remain an obstacle for leveling digital access. And this kind of talks about the kind of work and the pushback that happens in order to address issues, particularly of marginalized groups. There's another question from Kimani Nyoike, and maybe we'll just, Klengiwe, you will get in on this because you did speak particularly about, misinformation, surveillance, what happens online. And Kimani asks, what happens in situations that governments are using covert ways to spread misinformation? And because this is rife in Kenya with the so-called government bloggers. You are muted, Klengiwe.
Yes, thank you for letting me. I realized I was talking to myself. Yeah, unfortunately, we do have situations where governments use this, like the colleague said, covert methods to spread misinformation. And there's an example that is being stated there of government bloggers in Kenya. I just want to say in that scenario, yes, because the question is saying what happens. There are implications really for that. For example, the undermining of trust. That's another thing that comes immediately to mind when I'm hearing something like this. The trust in public institutions, the media, or even fellow citizens. I mean, when the government is seen as a source of false information, obviously this this can lead to a lot of skepticism, and can also generate confusion, which is not very productive. But also it can also deepen a polarization within society and incite tensions or exacerbate conflicts that may already be existing in among different groups. Also, one of the things I think that comes to mind as that question is raised is that by controlling the narrative, governments can also manipulate, public opinion to maintain power or influence over certain issues. This can be in other contexts. It could be an issue of elections, for example. And when that happens, it does undermine, democratic processes and fair competition. But also misinformation campaigns, as they've been explained, they can be used, and they are actually being used to discredit critics or those with dissenting voices. Especially, we have seen labels such as fake news, or foreign agents, and this does a lot create a chilling effect. And it then sometimes in very repressive environments, this discourages criticism, which is very legitimate and which is a form of activism, and that can be suppressed. And those dissenting voices that you need in a democracy. If it's an election, it's a situation of contestation, and dissenting voices should be encouraged, and they should be allowed, but that can be curtailed when people are labeled as foreign agents or perpetrating fake news. So let me stop there for now.
Malebo, you're on
Malebo,
mute.
I think you're mute.
4 years later, we've been doing this and we still forget to unmute. Thank you so much. So as I was saying that we've heard from, all the panelists around the risks that have been posed by current digital governance frameworks to civil liberties. So what question that I want to link to this is Maya, or is it Mia Mazotto, is saying, you have mentioned many important issues related to digital technologies and human rights. But in a world with limited resources, what do you think that the priorities should be for efforts by civil society organization in digital governance advocacy? Are there any particular issues that you think that are being overlooked? This is particularly in terms of how do you advocate for those marginalized voices and, looking at the most effective strategies, particularly for pushback against the digital policies or trade agreements, that can be harm that can pose harm for public interest. So I think, Christian, can you take that question? Because we only have 4 minutes left and we're still going to have closing contributions. So Christian, can you take that question instead of the whole panelists?
Yes, sure. Thank you. This is a very, very complex question.
Yeah.
I believe that given the context in which we are of a more realistic geopolitical scenario, more crude with respect of the interests and conflicts that we are living right now, there may be a setback or for the open participation of all interest parties or all stakeholders. What I'm saying may seem a little contradictory with the idealism that surrounds the GDC, YCs, Net Mundial, and other spaces, but these are spaces that are also being convened after 10, 20 years, because clearly there is something to be redirected. So 15 or 20 years ago, we did not have big tech as we have today. We did not have as many geopolitical conflicts as we have today. So in some conversations that I had with other organizations here in Latin America, there is a perspective of looking at regional rather than global spaces. Perhaps that is the way. So what to look is very important. What we are doing here in Bolivia is to work more with local governments, with local communities, and internationally, perhaps we should look at the convergence with other organizations through strengthening coalitions, networks. Here here in Latin America, we have Al Sur, and we have some success moving some advocacy capacities in some international forums. We should strengthen more global South communities, not only regional ones, but in support with some global NGOs like Oxfam, like Access Now, and so on. I think it's time to join forces, exchange capacities, build together governance capacities for advocacy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christian. And I'm going to ask a question to Fengiwe. I'm going to borrow 2 minutes from our audience, just so that I can ask this question. Fengiwe, you did speak about the protection of children. I want you to speak more on that and also add in terms of how then do you look, particularly for marginalized groups who do not have access, particularly women, and the protection of children. I haven't heard much about, the gender disparities that exist. So Tlengiwe, can you touch on that? And only because you had actually said you'd want to speak on that. So yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Malebo, for that. Yeah, that's another area that is very close to my heart, the issue of children. I think the label, that is given to children about them being digital natives it gives this impression that children know what they are doing in the digital space. It gives an impression that they are okay, they are fine, they are born in this situation. But actually, when you're looking at the risks and the harms associated with it, and research that has been conducted, it points to a very different scenario, actually a very sad scenario where children actually find themselves being harmed and facing a lot of challenges in actually navigating this space that we think they know very well. And just based on that, it really calls to the for a need to actively look into this and interrogate this whole being digital natives that we have labeled children to be, and actually realize that just by virtue of being a child, one is vulnerable. And by them being in the digital space, it makes them it increases their vulnerability. And their vulnerability, just because they are called digital natives, does not it doesn't get lowered because they are in the digital natives and they are working with technology which they know. Actually, we need to do more in educating children or focusing on how to create safe spaces for children online. And this makes it very complex because when you're looking at parenting in the offline world, it has its own complications. But when you are looking at parenting in the digital age, you find that it has more complexities that are attached to it. And the focus should not just be on children, the focus should be on the parents and the caregivers. It should be on the educators, it should be on the duty bearers itself. So there is more work that is actually needed as we focus more and more on children, because I see that the vulnerabilities that come with the online space or the digital space, they are more complex, they are more complicated, and they require a lot of whether it's around regulation, but there's a lot of education as well that is required, because the space is generally not safe, and parents as well are not very prepared to navigate that particular space and assist children.
Your closing remarks in 1 minute, half a minute, 2 seconds. Thank you.
Just to reiterate that in the conversations around digital technologies, existing and emerging ones, we need to prioritize the issue of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian.
Thank you for all your ideas. It was really interesting to share these ideas with you. So I think it's a very important moment for think around how we can articulate better, build coalitions, join our forces, because the world is now in a very big conflict, and as civil society organizations, the academia, activists, we should work together to build a better advocacy, I think.
Thank you so much. Africa?
Yeah, just two brief ones. One is, I think we should look at a competition policy in terms of regulating big tech and data is one of the areas that need updating really. The second one, I believe that we should leverage our cooperation as civil society, engage more our governments, which are engaged in binding process like at the World Trade Organization, because while, for example, the Global Compact is okay, but it does not impact much in terms of was not binding. So by engaging more, mobilizing, engaging more on binding process like an WTO, we are able to achieve human rights and all that pertain to the economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists. We really appreciate your time and coming to give us this conversation. The conversation goes on. There will be resources. Further resources from our panelists and organization will be sent to all participants who attended today's session. It will be sent next week. If you'd like to get in touch with our contributors and to ask them more questions, to find out about their work, you can do this via the team here at the center. Please send an email to Ryan. Ryan's email address will be in the chat box. And I see there are more comments in the chat box. Mia speaks about the work from Oxfam. There's a link there. You can also access that link there. All our dialogues are available for on-demand viewing on the digital dialogue section of the center's website, and the link will be posted in the chat box. I'm Malebusi Podi. Thank you again to my panelists for joining. Thank you to the audience for giving us extra time. We really appreciate it, and may this conversation go on, particularly on how we advocate for voices of those who are not heard, and how there's self-determinism in the way that we look at these issues. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good morning, evening, and good day. Bye-bye.